Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 64 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. So at the very least, this was a better performance than the first matchup between these two teams, in which the Sharks just got absolutely wrecked 3-0. But this time around, while the Sharks did look slightly better, it still ended up with the same result of a loss for the Sharks. And it turns out, continuously going down by a goal going into the third period or into the third period in general is not necessarily a consistent strategy to win games. They managed to do it a few days ago against the Coyotes, came back from a 1-goal deficit in the third period to win. They managed to do it a couple of days ago against the Calgary Flames as well, but here tonight they come into the third down 2-1 and they end up losing it 5-2 in general. Sharks need to start getting off to a better 41st minutes if they want to go back into the winning column. Now, this game was an interesting one, like the game against the Flames, because there was a newcomer to the lineup. In the previous one against the Flames, there was Shemalevsky, the return of John Leonard, but here tonight, it was the Sharks' newest goaltender, Kaapo Kähkönen, getting the start, and we were going to see just exactly where he stacked up. Would he be just as good as James Reimer? Would he find himself somewhere between him and Adin Hill, or would he find himself as sort of an Adin Hill type replacement, inconsistent at best? Well, let's find out. In the first period, it ended up being a period that I would say was mostly Oilers favored. It started off in the first few minutes, definitely in control for Edmonton. Then the Sharks had the puck a bit for the next maybe few minutes, and then later on in the first period, it was once again back in Oilers' possession. So generally, a period favored towards Edmonton, but in the end, the Sharks didn't give up a ton of chances, like actual chances on net, just a good amount of zone time, and so it was a 0-0 game after one. In the second period, things definitely evened up a bit, and the Sharks executed a very nice passing play to give themselves a 1-goal lead in this game, coming from Erik Carlson, his 10th of the year. However, the Sharks would then go on to the penalty kill, which was normally, has been for pretty much the entirety of this season, a strength for the San Jose Sharks, but maybe due to the departures of both Jacob Middleton and Andrew Cogliano at the trade deadline, but the Sharks' penalty kill has looked significantly weaker as of late, and Yamamoto is just allowed to walk pretty much right in here to score the goal past Kähkönen to tie the game up at 1. Then there is a pretty controversial play, I guess you could say. Erik Carlson ends up getting knocked down by a cross-check from Zach Cashin. He loses the puck. Puck makes its way to Leon Draisaitl, who is able to score past Kaapo Kähkönen. First of all, it should be noted this was a bit of a weak goal, so with slightly better goaltending from Kähkönen, this puck probably doesn't end up going in. Having said that, the real conversation obviously stems from whether or not Zach Cashin should have been assessed a cross-checking penalty for this particular play. And a lot of people point to the previous penalty to Jeff Viel just a few minutes earlier, where he ended up getting a call on a very similar type of play, and he was, of course, assessed a penalty for it in the offensive zone. Personally, I actually agree with Erik Carlson in this situation. It was kind of a 50-50 play. I would not have been surprised to see a cross-checking penalty in that particular situation, especially with just the play that it ended up leading to. I definitely would not have been surprised to see a ref make that call. However, I can also tell you that when I saw that play happen and then Leon Draisaitl score that goal, I wasn't, my first instinct wasn't to be insanely angry that, oh, refs, how did you manage to miss that call? Because honestly, it wasn't that hard of a push. I think Carlson just obviously with that push lost balance a bit, and it's just kind of a play that happens a lot during a game just because this was in a very precarious situation. Maybe you'd like to see it get called, but I don't think it was necessarily as egregious as some previous missed calls thus far this season. Anyhow, that would be the score at the end of the second period, 2-1 Edmonton. Into the third period, you would think after those two previous games that the Sharks would have a strong end to this game, but that didn't necessarily end up being the case. The Oilers would score the first goal of the third period to put themselves up 3-1, though the Sharks would quickly respond with a Tomas Hertl goal to put it back to within 1. But there was very little push from the San Jose Sharks over these last few minutes. Eventually, another power play goal, again, just poor penalty killing from the San Jose Sharks as pucks are allowed to make their way right through the slot and then right back in with absolutely zero coverage of man-to-man. The box is supposed to be the sacred box of the penalty kill, where not a lot of pucks are supposed to be able to move through there, and you're supposed to keep pucks to the outside, but It moved through there twice in about the span of 2-3 seconds, and it ends up in the back of the Sharks' net. Eventually, the Sharks pull the goaltender, but unlike, some of the drama that we saw in the previous game from the Flames side when they had the goaltending pulled, the Sharks got literally nothing going, as within just a few seconds, the Oilers got the puck back and managed to score in the empty net, and to make matters worse, it was Evander Kane, and as such, the Oilers took the win 5-2. On to the players to talk about. Really, the only line that was really going for the San Jose Sharks here tonight was this first line, kind of a throwback to the middle part of this season where Barabanov, Hertl, and Meier had a very impressive game. Obviously, they managed to score the 2 goals of this game. Hertl off of a very nice pass from Timo Meier. And then while, of course, it was Carlson, a defenseman, scoring, it was off of a tic-tac-toe play from Meier and Tomas Hertl. Barabanov didn't factor in on either of those 2 goals, but certainly played a big role here in this game. He was the one who actually made a pretty nice play, I would say, to get out of his own zone that led to this first goal from Erik Carlson. So generally a very strong game from the first line, but it's when you look past them where things absolutely do fall apart. We got I guess you could say a new look to the second line, but it was a look that the Sharks had at the end of the Flames game, which was Couture being joined by Noah Gregor and Sasha Chmelevski, and this line just didn't really have that same magic that they had at the end of the Flames game. I would say there were maybe a couple of shifts that weren't too bad for this line, but generally they couldn't really get anything established in the offensive zone. Chmelevski definitely looked a bit out of place at the NHL level. You could definitely see he was struggling with the fact that there's so much less space to work with in the NHL compared to the AHL. Every time he seemed to have the puck, he kind of hesitated with it, and as such, there was just a man on him immediately, or at least immediately from his perspective, and he would frequently just sort of lose the puck or make kind of a weak play into the zone. So Chmelevski definitely struggling a bit, which did also cause this line as a whole to struggle. Couture also should be mentioned that he ended up taking a puck to the midsection, or maybe a bit higher up than that, and he left the game. I was a bit surprised to see him not return. It didn't look super serious, though, of course, as I usually say, I am not a doctor, so I obviously can't know for sure. It is suspected that it probably isn't long-term. It seems as though that Bob Booner is hoping that this is just going to be some sort of day-to-day situation, but of course, you never know. When it comes to the third line, I guess you could say this was the Sharks' second best line, though that's obviously not saying too much. It was also a bit of a new look here. Bonino joined by Balcers and Leonard. They had maybe a couple more good shifts than what the second line had. Also, they weren't as sort of lost, I guess you could say. Leonard also working with significantly less space at the NHL level compared to the AHL level, so he's not exactly going to be able to be the point per game player that he was for a good stretch of games with the Barracuda, but he still had a couple of okay plays that could maybe keep him with a lineup spot, especially if Logan Couture is injured. The Sharks don't necessarily have a lot of players to fill in for him, so I suspect he does manage to stay in the lineup. When it comes to both Boninos and Balcers, I don't think it was terrible games from either of these two players, but they certainly didn't make much of an impact either. When it comes to the fourth line of Gadjevich, Reedy, and VL, they had a couple of okay shifts in the first period. I thought their first 2 or 3 shifts were pretty solid, but at that point it seemed as though it kind of just fell off. Eventually VL, like I said, did take that offensive zone penalty, and after that I didn't really notice them all that much in this game. On the defensive side of things, the first pairing of Burns and Megna, I talked about Megna having a really rough game in the previous one. I thought he did bounce back decently well here tonight. Nothing super impressive, but certainly what you would hope from a stay-at-home defenseman like Jacob Megna. Burns, I didn't think was actually all that bad in this game. I liked actually for once his offensive side of the things. Usually in the previous games, I've been criticizing him significantly defensively, and I've never really had anything positive offensively to say about him because he hasn't really been doing much offensively. He does have a decent amount of points, but it always feels just sort of inconsequential points, like, oh, he happened to have the second assist here or something of that nature. But here tonight, I thought he was actually doing some pretty solid things with the puck on the offensive side, so that was definitely nice to see. Obviously, the two players to talk about here tonight, probably the two most interesting players on the defensive side for the Sharks, are both Carlson and Merkley. These two players were once again paired together at the start of this game, but very, very quickly separated. It felt as though they only had a few shifts together. There was this one particular shift where Carlson made a nice pass to Merkley at the point, who then fed it back to Carlson for a very good chance. Carlson then just barely missed the net in that particular regard. But when I start first with Erik Karlsson, because these two players were separated in the end, as Merkley ended up with Vlasic for most of the rest of the game and Carlson with Miloš. Carlson had an extremely up and down game. That's basically been his MO over these past few games, you could definitely say. There, on the defensive side of things, there were some bad giveaways. There was obviously that play on the second goal for the Oilers where he got cross-checked, you could say, by Cashin, which is hard to say. Is it his fault in particular for trying to stick handle in a position like that, or is that a play that Carlson makes all the time and just in this time he ended up getting infracted with? It's hard to really argue because I don't want to exactly say that Carlson shouldn't be trying to make plays like that, because that's exactly his game. That's what he always tries to do. He's not the type of guy who's just going to make one quick pass out of the defensive zone. He likes to try and carry that puck out, and so I feel like it is incorrect to try and change that part of his game. Like I saw Bob Booner say as a post-game quote where he says, players as the last man into the zone need to stop trying to stick handle. I understand the reason with that, and for most players I think that's okay to say, but for Carlson you give a bit more leeway in that particular regard. Anyhow, like I said, the defensive side of things were not great for Carlson, but on the offensive side of things, he had a myriad of extremely good chances. He scored a goal. He probably could have had two more with a bit more luck. There was that great shot pass from Brent Burns on the power play that Carlson then redirected towards the net that Mike Smith had to come up with a big save on. There was the play with Merkley that I mentioned just a bit earlier where he just shot wide. So it was a very good offensive game for Carlson, but on the defensive side, not so much. When it comes to Ryan Merkley, I thought he had a very strong start to the game. When he was still played with Carlson, or when he was still paired with Carlson, he actually had some very strong shifts, and I'd say the first period was far and away his best period, but once he got placed with Vlasic, things just absolutely fell off a cliff, and he just looked a step behind the game for the rest of it for the last 40 minutes. He was making some bad reads on certain pinches. He was letting players sneak behind him, and just generally, I thought for once, a benching of Ryan Merkley that Bob Booner inevitably did was a bit more justified here tonight compared to many of the other nights that he had. And when it comes to the final defensive pairing, Vlasic and Miloš, kind of disappointing as well. I thought Miloš in particular had a really bad game here tonight, which is unusual, I guess you could say, for Miloš, because he's usually relatively steady. I would say Vlasic as well. Maybe you could even blame him a bit for the issues that Merkley had in those last couple of periods, though definitely Merkley had his own issues personally. But Vlasic also was really struggling, you definitely could say. There was this one particular shift with Merkley and Vlasic where it seems as though they were having a competition for who could sort of have their controller disconnected for the longest. Merkley held the puck for way too long, then just barely managed to feed the puck away to Vlasic, who then also held the puck for even longer, and eventually ended up with a defensive zone turnover that gave the Oilers a chance. So generally that was just an encompassment of Merkley and Vlasic's game here tonight. When it comes to Kähkönen, the goaltender for the Sharks here, I mentioned already that the Draisaitl goal was definitely a weak one for him. The other two, the other three, I should say, I wouldn't necessarily blame him on. The Yamamoto one was a bit difficult, though not necessarily a save that it would be impossible to see. The Draisaitl one, the second Draisaitl one, was a very difficult save, definitely. And then when it comes to the Brassard one, that one goes off the skate of Carlson, so you give him a bit of a pass there. But the first Draisaitl one obviously sticks out like a sore thumb. It wasn't a terrible debut for Kähkönen, but you were maybe hoping for slightly better. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Anaheim Ducks. If I had to guess, we would likely see James Reimer back into the lineup. And when it comes to the forwards and defensive pairings, I'm not exactly sure what to expect from them, but we'll hopefully get a nice competitive game because the Sharks-Ducks games thus far this season have been rather close. Class dismissed.